Hello and welcome to History Hack's dedicated Second World War air power podcast, Hedge-Hopping, with me, Matt Bone. The North American Aviation P-51 Mustang is an aircraft of legend. The popular history is of an aircraft that was created in just 100 days, was ignored by the US Army Air Force, and was a disappointment until that magical day it was mated with a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. But the question is, was the Allison-engined Mustang really so disappointing? As author, historian, and history hack returnee, Matthew Willis's new book, Mustang, The Untold Story, shows the Mustang was not quite the damp squid we've come to believe, but it was a hit with the crews from the off. It was just the aircraft the RAF needed, and this was all before that magical Merlin showed up. So, Matt, how have you been? It's been a while since episode 166 on Toronto. What have you been up to?
Hi Matt. I've been finishing off this book on the Mustang, which I've been working on for a long time. It's getting on for 10 years since I started work on it, so it feels like a long journey just coming to an end. I've been working on other stuff. Can't stay too far away from naval aviation, so the Bristol Scout has had my attention for a while with its being the first aircraft to sort of make an operational launch from a ship at sea, first land plane, I should say, and various interesting stuff like that. So yeah, but the Mustang, which is a bit of a departure for me, but it was just an absolutely fascinating aircraft. And as you said, it's one of those aircraft that once you get into it, you start to realize that so much you thought you know about it is wrong. So that was what made it particularly special to look at.
This is decidedly unboaty for you, so this is gonna be quite fun.
Yeah, it is. It's I don't just do boaty planes, but this one is a particularly not boaty plane, and yeah, it's sort of I just sort of fell into working on it, really, and it was only ever going to be like a short-term thing. It was something I was commissioned to do, as I say, nearly 10 years ago now. And the idea at the time was, I'll just do this thing, and it'll just it'll bring some money in, and it's a bit off the usual run of things for me, but I'll just do this. Well, it was going to be a pair of books, but fairly sort of straightforward stuff on the Mustang. And as soon as I got into it, I started to find these things that, oh, well, actually, that's not what we thought. That's not what we thought. As soon as you start hitting the primary sources, and even really a lot of stuff that's in the published material that perhaps hasn't necessarily been drawn out too much, certainly isn't in the popular conception. And the one thing that I do enjoy with any sort of study of aviation history really is those areas where we think we know it all, and then it turns out that once you start examining sort of from the root of it again, that actually there's a different story there than the one that we were told, and there are stories that have been a little bit ignored or brushed over, and that's just a red rag to a bull as far as I'm concerned.
Definitely, you kindly sent over a copy of the book, which I've had a little read before this, and it is fascinating. I've always fallen into that trap of thinking, oh, it wasn't anything until the Merlin, and then of course in my research you start reading about the TACAR ops on D-Day, and they're just
Mm,
absolutely mind blowing. And then you
yeah.
realize that wasn't the fancy Merlin engine one, that was the
Hmm.
Allison. So
Yeah, yeah. And by that time it was aircraft that were several years old, airframes that were several years old that had been worked hard, and they'd been there. Many of these Mark Ones, particularly, that had been there sort of almost from the beginning of RAF Mustang operations, and they'd led a hard life, and they were still going strong. Long after Normandy, and that kind of gets forgotten, really. I mean, yeah, you sort of, Second Tactical Air Force, we think of Typhoons, obviously, and Spitfire Mark 14s, and then getting into Meteors and things like that. And they were relatively small number of these Allison Mustangs that were still hanging around in Northern Europe after the invasion, but they were doing vital work, and actually the RAF was kind of sorry it couldn't have more of them, even by this point, an aircraft that was sort of getting on for 3 years old. And it's this is sort of occasionally in other stories, these Allison Mustangs pop up, where there was a book a few years ago about the Spitfires used as dive bombers against the V2 operations, and actually the Mustangs were used quite heavily in identifying the targets, and then in doing all the photo recon after the Spitfire strikes, and sometimes in the middle of them you'd have a photo recon aircraft stooging through in the middle to sort of keep a record of this raid and see actually how well the Spits were dropping their bombs. But this is kind of, we've come in right at the end there. This is
we're seeding the conversation so people listen all the way to the end.
Absolutely, yeah. We're starting in medias res. There are all these areas, and actually it was an aircraft that had really widespread use. It was in use in Northern Europe. It was the first single-seater to operate from Britain to cross the border into Germany, and then it was in use in the Mediterranean, in North Africa. It was in use in the Far East, in the China, Burma, India theatre. There's a small selection of types there. So you had basically about 4 variants of the Allison Mustang, which were quite closely related. And I can't think of that many other aircraft that were made in relatively small numbers. You're talking sort of really 1,000 odd that saw such widespread service in different parts of the war. And I think it's again an aircraft that doesn't really get appreciated just how much it did. And it was really punching above its weight in terms of the number of airframes. It wherever it turned up, it made quite a pivotal difference. So that's all those things were interesting to me, and the things that we think we know about it, insofar as people, aviation historians of the Second World War, even kind of think about it much at all. And it was something that as soon as I scratched the surface of it, it just became more and more apparent that we needed a proper history of just those Allison-engined variants and what they did and how it all happened, and again also the men who made a success of it, as well as it just being about nuts and bolts.
I think we've touched on a lot of the myths there already, haven't we? The big one being that it was nothing until that magical day at Farnborough when it was decided to give it a go. But just as we're going to pop some of these as we go through, I hope, what are some of those, what are some of the myths that we're hopefully going to pop as we go along, the sort of big ticket items that everybody thinks about these aircraft?
Well, there are so many, and they sort of touch every aspect of the Allison Mustang story, really. The first one, as you say, the big one, is that it wasn't very good with the Allison engine. And actually there are elements of it that were better than the Merlin Mustang. And this is something that I think a lot of people don't really appreciate, was that in some regimes, for some tasks, the Allison Mustang was better than the Merlin Mustang, in some cases considerably better. There are myths over what it was called, what different versions of it were called. And, this is actually, there are elements of this we'll probably come to, the sort of debate that rages today that we haven't ever really quite been able to pin down from the documentation. There were myths about how it came to be, and you mentioned that sort of 100-day kind of, that sort of totemic figure that shows how quickly it was produced. And that's again been something that's been quite difficult to narrow down. There are myths over the USAF or USAAF as it was at the time, not being interested in it. There are other myths that the USAF was really interested in it, but didn't have money in the right budget. So this was how they created the A-36 dive bomber, was, as the story goes, they didn't want a dive bomber at all, but they had money in the attack budget. So they used this to cleverly buy a fighter, which the other version of the myth has it that they overlooked and weren't interested in. So this is again, it's something that that there are so many sort of elements of the story of the Mustang's creation, and the Allison versions of it in particular, which were sort of the first ones that the US got their hands on, the same as the same as the British. And it permeates every aspect of the aircraft's development. And there are tiny myths and there are great big myths, and I think part of the problem is this sort of legend of the Mustang, which is now there's such a legendary aircraft. The very, very few aircraft sort of attain that kind of status, where because the narrative of it is so strong, and in the same way that British have this narrative of the Mustang, which was only existed because we ordered it, and it was only good after we gave it an engine. And at the same time, the Americans have their great myth of the Mustang, their great legend of the Mustang, I should say, because not all of it is untrue. It's just the way it's framed is framed as a narrative of this great aircraft that was created in double quick time, that had all these new technologies on it, that allowed the bombers to go into Germany, that was there in that kind of death blow of German industry when the B-24s and B-17s were flying right into the heart of Germany and just pounding. The bombers were pounding it day and night, and the aircraft that made that possible was the Mustang. So there are these narratives, these myths, these legends that you kind of have to break down before you get into the real history. I mean, I find the real history no less remarkable than these narratives. It's just that these are the stories that we've grown up with, and it's it becomes very difficult to challenge them. And in a sense, I'm not coming along to say, that one aircraft is a bad aircraft or another aircraft is a good aircraft. It's just that we've been looking at these things with slightly the wrong colored spectacles, and it doesn't hurt to have a new look at these things. And the Allison Mustang, there's a lot there that people want to look at. There are some remarkable stories, and the dive bomber version, which actually did remarkable work in the Mediterranean as an attack aircraft. And it's all these things which kind of get brushed over, and is just worth us having a look again in the round, I think, because again, it's there are some aspects of it which have been looked at, and like Peter C. Smith, who's written a lot on dive bombers, wrote a book on the A36, the dive bomber version of the Mustang, which again we'll talk about this when we get to the Mediterranean. Was never called the Apache. Well, let's knock that one absolutely on the head right now. The name Apache is completely spurious. So it's kind of as you get through these things, there are so many of these myths, and it's like, well, where do you start? I'll leave you to guide the conversation, because otherwise I'll just leap in and start listing things.
The Apache thing is always a pity, because I think it's a great name for an aircraft.
It is. Yeah. It is. It's true.
But let's start at the beginning with that 100 days, and a rather remarkable designer, of which there's some interesting myths have come up about him as well.
Well, yeah. Indeed. Edgar Schmoyer, who was the chief designer for North American Aviation. He was of German birth, and had grown up in Germany, and had his first introduction into the aircraft industry in Germany in the 1920s. Because of the situation with the aircraft industry in Germany after the First World War, where there were so many restrictions and the industry was really quite small until the 1930s, he sought work outside of Germany and found his way to Brazil, where he started working for an aircraft company that was owned by General Motors. And through that, then found his way to the United States, where he began doing design work for Fokker's US subsidiary, which at the time was becoming more of an autonomous company. For a while, then that was bought by General Motors, and then through a process of kind of separating from the parent Fokker company, and through becoming more autonomous, and then it eventually became North American Aviation, and it moved to California, which at the time meant that Edgar Schmoyer left the company because he wanted to stay where he was on the east coast of America. His wife didn't want to move, so he worked for the Belanca company for a while, much smaller company, tended to make bush planes and sporting aircraft and an aircraft like that. Then tragically, his wife was killed, and he, there was nothing then stopping him from going to California and joining North American Aviation, where he started working for them in the sort of mid to late 30s. And North American Aviation was one of these companies that it was typically American. It was a really it was like a young company. It had this sort of young energy. They wanted to, they had a lot to prove. They wanted to do an awful lot sort of, from the beginning. So they were sort of creating these modern aircraft, almost coming from very small beginnings to suddenly get massive contracts for particularly training aircraft. So the AT-6 is obviously was their big kind of breakout aircraft that was, got them noticed, and it got them noticed by the British, particularly the British Air Ministry, who was on the lookout for training aircraft to meet the needs of the expanding RAF. And and they started work on bombers as well. Again, sort of really with very little experience in this kind of aircraft. There was a sort of a transitional bomber which they designed, which didn't really work, but then they learned an awful lot from that to create the B-25, which was one of the most important aircraft of the Second World War. Built in huge numbers, and very, very effective. Again, it was a typically North American aircraft in that it was relatively straightforward. It worked well. It had sort of modern features where it needed them, but otherwise it was focused on practicality. They built amazingly practical aircraft, North American, but without compromising where it mattered, which I think actually was one of the key secrets to the Mustang's success. Was just how practical it was. But yeah, so that was Edgar Schmoyer. But the one thing that he hadn't done when the British came calling in 1939, 1940, he hadn't designed from the ground up to sort of detailed design to prototype stage a fighter aircraft. That was a completely new job as far as he's concerned. So I think another thing about the Mustang is even more remarkable is that it was North American's first real fighter. Not quite its first fighter, because there was this earlier attempt, but that was really, there was an aircraft called the NA-50, which was basically just a sort of a lightly fighterized version of the AT-6, which was done as a sort of cheap export fighter for small air forces, and it was used by sort of some South American air forces, and there was a version of it that was used, I think, by the Thai Air Force. That was a trainer turned into a fighter. It did not start from the ground up as a fighter aircraft. So for Shmurd to do that, and his first real job, and to come up with the Mustang, it's even R.J. Mitchell had a misfire before he did the Spitfire, and it just kind of came from nowhere. So the 100 days you mentioned, I think it's actually like 100 and something days. I can't, this is something that I've pulled out of my head, because when we looked into it, we found it wasn't really true. It was one of these myths that came about. And when you start to look at those various versions of this 100 and something days, which is that when is it from and when is it to? Myself and my research partner Bob Sickle, who's a guy in the States who knows far more about the P-51 than 99.9% of people. We started looking into this, and you kind of think, well, there's different versions of it. There's from the time it was first ordered to the first flight of the prototype, and that's not 100 and something days. And there was when it was first ordered to the first rollout, and that's not quite the amount of time that it said as well. And there's the time that the contract was signed, because that was different from the first expression of interest to one of these various things. And basically, we couldn't make this 100 and something days fit. We couldn't ever quite get the well, where's it to and where's it from? And this is North American publicity. A lot of the myth making was done by North American, and it's fair enough, because it was their aeroplane. And there was all the publicity after the war that they were building this legend for themselves. They were also trying to kind of ease other people and other organizations out of the picture, which again, it's what companies do. And it's people kind of setting up their own legacy as well. And there's certain figures from from North American, Dutch Kindleberger, who was the guy in charge, really. Leland Atwood, who was one of the chief engineers, and the chief aerodynamicist, Ed Hawkey, and people like that who were sort of had one eye on their legacy, and they were pushing their angle of the story. To go back to the beginning, 1940, the war suddenly going very badly with the fall of France, or towards the fall of France. Before this point, the British have not been terribly impressed by American aircraft. They've not been especially favourable about what they've gone over to see in terms of fighter aircraft, which, at the time you've got things like the Curtiss P-36, the early P-40, which is just coming through, which hasn't actually flown at the time, but the design is there and it's kind of available to see. You've got the kind of the Grumman fighters, you've got the Brewster fighters, the Buffalo and things like that. And the British Air Ministry thinks America's a little bit behind the curve in terms of fighters. It's interested in its trainer aircraft. It's interested to an extent in its bombers, but it's not terribly interested in fighters. And then you get May 1940. Germany invades France and Belgium, and suddenly they're tearing through these countries, and it looks like we've got weeks until Germany has overrun France, and all our projections go out the window. We think we've got France as a buffer between us and Germany. We think we've got France as a powerful ally with a large modern military with us, and suddenly those things don't look like they're happening anymore. And then, you've got the worst case scenario. You've got the real kind of doomsday scenario that Germany's going to send its bombers over from French airfields, and they're going to be able to knock out the British aircraft industry in a matter of days or weeks. So suddenly we've come from this point where we're not that bothered about US aircraft to the point where we need any aircraft that are vaguely modern, up to date, and have half a chance of countering the Luftwaffe. Whether or not they're the ideal thing that we want doesn't really matter. We just need them, and we need them yesterday. So British have already sent an air commission over to the US to look at what we can get from them. What they've been trying to do at the time is, buy the stuff that we're interested in buying, but even to the extent of saying, well, can we use your factories to build our stuff? Which the Americans quite understandably say, not going to happen. But, we pushed that for a while. And then it comes to sort of May, June 1940, and things are looking very, very bad. And we're starting to look at what we can go and buy. And the French have already started buying stuff from Curtiss. They've bought P-36 fighters. They've bought some P-40s, bought some Grumman fighters. And when France falls, Britain takes over those orders. And it makes sense to try and extend them. The US are being quite accommodating. They're saying, well, actually, we have these rules on the aircraft that we'll release for export, but we're going to relax those rules. And, they're not just doing this for sort of, because it's the right thing to do. The American government realizes that they've got golden opportunity to have the material that their aircraft designers and companies are developing tested in the crucible of European air combat at zero cost. In fact, even to get paid to do it. So this is something that's actually extraordinarily attractive to the American government. So we go over, the British Air Commission approaches Curtiss and says, we'd like to buy some of your new P-40 fighters, please. Curtiss says, yeah, sure, but we don't have the capacity to build all of those that you want and the ones that we're already building for the US Army Air Corps, as it is at the time. They start to look for other companies that can license build the P-40. And one of these companies that the British are already familiar with through their large orders for training aircraft is North American Aviation. So they approach North American and say, we'd like you to build Curtiss fighters, please. And again, this is actually kind of another one of these tiny myths. The story is P-40s that they wanted to build. There was actually a new fighter that Curtiss was developing at the time called the P-46, which was a sort of a development of the P-40. I mean, if you see a picture of it, it's basically like a smaller, slightly neater P-40. And this was to be powered by a new version of the Allison V12, V1710 engine, which was called the F model, which had a different reduction gear and various other slight modifications. And it was the reduction gear that made the big difference, because the earlier model that was in the early P40s wasn't that reliable. And certainly Britain had lots of problems with their early P40s up to the C model. But this new model, Allison, looked quite promising. So the British Air Commission said to North American, we'd like you to build these P46s, please, because we've ordered hundreds of them. North American, Dutch Kindleberger had a word with Edgar Schmoyer, and Kindleberger says to Shmurd, the British want us to build P46s. I think we can do better than that. What do you say? And Shmurd agrees that he, this guy who's never designed a fighter aircraft before, can, in I think 40 days was the time they were given to produce a design, create a fighter that's better than Curtiss can do. Now, bear in mind, Curtiss is they've been building fighter aircraft, single engine fighter aircraft company since the early 1920s. They had their hugely successful Hawk series of biplanes. They transitioned to the monoplane relatively early. They transitioned to the all metal, stress skin monoplane quite early with the P-36. And although, Europeans aren't that impressed with Curtiss, they are, in the US terms, they're the granddaddies of the fighter aircraft. They're the people who have all the knowledge, all the expertise. They keep winning competitions to supply the US Air Corps with fighters. They are the people to beat. They are the sort of, they are the A game in fighters. And this guy from what's still a relatively small company, who's never designed a fighter before, says to his boss, I can do better than that. And he does. And this is the first part of the story where, by rights, it should think without trace. They should produce a design. The British should say, nah, and thanks but no thanks, and all go on their way. But Shmurd has a number of things up his sleeve which enables him to perform this feat.
North American has that feel of a modern tech startup, isn't it? They're pushing the envelope. They're jumping on everything that they can, and they just know that they're lighter, they're more agile, and they can do it. And I guess the next bit Shmurd's got is he's got a lot of vital research from the late 1930s, which gives him an edge in developing this new aircraft.
Yeah, absolutely. He has kept his finger on the pulse of all these developments that have been coming out of aeronautical theory in the last few years. And, there are some big changes that have are coming through all the time. And this is perhaps where companies like Curtiss fall down, is that they're relying on their considerable experience, and they're perhaps not looking at the really lightning pace of development that's been going on in theory over the last few years. There are things that are that have now passed into legend in terms of the Mustang, but North American, they got there first, and crucially they made it work, which not everybody did. And just to sort of briefly go through some of those developments, I mean, the one that gets least attention is that Shmurd used a process called conic lofting to develop the fuselage. And this is where basically all of the surfaces on the sort of the main fuselage section of the Mustang are a section of a cone. So, they're aerodynamically sound. They give kind of minimal disruption to the air, but it's only single curvature. They were one of the first aircraft to almost be built from the outside in. So they're quite a thick skin, and the whole thing was built around the skin rather than the sort of traditional sense where you build frames and then you attach the skin to the side of it. So they're quite a thick skin, so the internal framing doesn't need to be as heavy, and also it just holds its shape better. So you're thinking there already of potential mass production and being produced in large numbers by people who don't have huge amount of skill, and easy to use, with easy to introduce mechanization on. So that's one development. He doesn't create an aircraft like the Spitfire, which is just covered in double curvature, and requires a lot of specialist tooling and specialist knowledge to produce simple shapes, but aerodynamically efficient. The second one is the laminar flow wing, which obviously, is now the way it's spoken about is almost like it was such an obvious thing, and North American did it first, and of course it worked, and big development. But this was a sort of, the timing here was crucial because the NACA had been looking at this, and they looked at this some years before.
Just to interrupt, for those who
yeah.
don't know, who are the NACA?
That is the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, and they're the forerunner of NASA. So they're basically the big research organization for anything to do with aircraft in the United States. So they're the people who are producing, lots of kind of like open source knowledge, I guess, to be employed by aircraft designers and manufacturers. And one of the things that they've been very successful at, for the previous decade, is wing airfoils. And they've been developing a series of wing airfoils, for all different applications that have been, used on all kinds of different aircraft. The Spitfire has an NACA airfoil. I think the Typhoon has an NACA airfoil.
It certainly does. You get your £5 for mentioning the Typhoon twice.
No problem. I'll see if I can get a third one in later on. It probably won't be so positive, but anyway, I will come to that. One of the things that the NACA has been looking at is these laminar flow airfoils. And just to explain what laminar flow is, airflow exists in three states. Laminar flow is where the air moves in smooth layers, and it moves in smooth lines, and it's undisrupted, and it kind of the layers kind of flow smoothly over one another. Transitional flow is the next one, where that laminar flow is starting to break down, and it's starting to form eddies. And then you have turbulent flow, where it's completely broken down and it's just all forming vortices and random eddies and spins and swirls. Turbulent flow is very, very sucking of energy. It's very hungry for energy. It just draws all that energy that you're pumping in through your engine, and it just wastes it in the air. So the longer you can prevent airflow from becoming turbulent, the more energy you save, the faster you're going to go. The simple idea with the laminar flow airfoil is to move the point at which the airflow starts to break down further back on the wing. Now, this is an idea that had been considered, some years before, certainly in the 1920s, but the NACA and various other organizations, including in the UK, the National Physical Laboratory, had done some work on this. They looked at aerofoils where you move because a traditional aerofoil is teardrop shape. It has its maximum point of thickness about a third of the way back, and then it tapers cleanly to the trailing edge. The idea here was to move that point of maximum thickness further back. The aerofoil is widening for a greater part of its width, and the air stays attached. There's nothing asking too much of the airflow, so it doesn't break away, it doesn't become turbulent. And those various organizations had tried testing these aerofoils in wind tunnels earlier on, and had decided that they didn't produce any advantage. So they kind of left those to one side. Later on in the 1930s, the state of the art in wind tunnels had improved, and it had continued to develop. And then you started to have things like compressed air wind tunnels, and even some of the first kind of transonic wind tunnels were starting to sort of arrive at that point. But they'd realized that actually the reason these aerofoils hadn't shown any advantage was possibly because of inefficiencies within the wind tunnel. And so it turned out that actually when they tried these things again in a more efficient wind tunnel, suddenly you started seeing improvements. And this was very, very new knowledge at this time. The NACA had they hadn't done what they usually did. They hadn't had time to, which is to produce a whole series of aerofoil designs at all kinds of different thicknesses for a series of different applications for air. So you've got an aerofoil that works well on a transport aircraft, one that works well on a bomber, one that works well on a fighter, and so on. The NACA didn't have that. They couldn't hand an aerofoil to North American and say, here, this aerofoil will work perfectly on a fighter, and you can just use it off the shelf. But so that was the second big aerodynamic innovation on the Mustang was the laminar flow wing. And I'd say more about that later on, but I just want to get to the third one, which is the Meredith effect. A British aerodynamicist or scientist by the name of F.W. Meredith had noted this effect whereby using a sort of a nozzle, so a narrowing gap for the air to flow through, and then heating it up as it exits, would produce an effect where it produces thrust. And usually the radiator on an aircraft is the source of considerable drag because it's just sitting there in the airflow. It's not doing anything except acting as a parachute and sucking air away. It's acting as a brake, but you need it there to cool your engine down. But it also produces heat. So what Meredith realized was if you could use the heat from the radiator within this nozzle effect, you could actually recoup quite a lot of the energy that you lost to the drag of the air hitting this radiator. And, I'm sure like aerodynamicists will tell me I've got that completely and utterly wrong. But the crux of it is you get some free energy if you can utilize the heat from the radiator and put that back into the airflow in such a way that you then gain something back from what you've lost to the drag of the radiator.
Same principle as a jet engine, isn't it?
Essentially, yeah.
It's heating air up and then squidging it and shooting it out the back.
Yeah, absolutely, very much so. And again, this was something that had been known about for several years, and the British had looked at it and concluded that actually the amount of heat that you get from a radiator is not really enough to get a significant effect. It's really at the very, very low level of that kind of effect. And what Meredith was essentially talking about was a jet engine. In terms of if you can get enough heat in there, then you will get a hell of a lot of free energy back, to the extent where even something like the SR-71, when it's traveling at sort of Mach 3 plus, it is getting most of the energy from the design of the nozzle and the spike within the jet nacelle than it's actually getting from the engine. So it's a powerful thing, but people thought it's not worth bothering about. Again, North American kind of had the wherewithal to look at this and say, well, actually, where can we get this to work? And even if we get a little bit of free energy, that's better than nothing. So that was really the three main innovations that came through on this design. As we say, Shmurd had never designed a fighter before. This was true. He'd never taken anything from clean sheet through to prototype before. However, he had been keeping tabs on the latest developments. And, according to people who'd worked with him, he was designing little bits of fighters kind of in his own time almost. And, he was designing like installations and sort of things like a cockpit layout, various things like that you'd need to design a fighter. He'd been thinking about and developing an element of it and then putting it to one side, so that when they finally got this order, this was how they were able to react so quickly and to produce something that was state of the art in a very short space of time. And although we say the 100 and something days was a myth, actually it was a remarkable turnaround when you consider how long Curtiss had been working on their fighters. That it was really a remarkably quick turnaround that they produced what was essentially the final Mustang design in a very, very short space of time. Details about it changed, but the main elements of the airframe and the form were all there really in that first design. So that was kind of how the Mustang came to be. And the British were impressed, and they ordered a number of these aircraft, with one caveat. They weren't quite so convinced that they were just prepared to leave Curtiss out of it altogether. So they basically demanded that North American acquire a certain amount of data from Curtiss on the P-46, and there was probably some on the P-40 in there as well. Just, in order to ensure that they could produce something, because they'd promised to produce something that was as good or better. And, so they had to buy this information from Curtiss, which actually what had been going on in the background at the time was the US Air Corps had been showing, they'd been kind of getting a bit cold feet about the P-46. This new version of the Allison that had come through, Curtiss had proposed, we'll say, well, if we fit this in the P-40 airframe, we can give you a lot more aircraft, and we think that actually the performance will be similar. And so that's how you get the P-40D version of the P-40, the Kitty Hawk in British service, and that, which becomes the definitive P-40 really. And so that kind of almost came about by mistake. So, Curtiss at this point are looking at losing a lot of their investment on the P-46. So actually, they get a bit of a bung from the British who say, you've got to sell this information to North America, and you've got to buy this information from Curtiss. Curtiss are happy enough to sell it because this aircraft's a little bit of a dead duck at the time. The Americans are happy enough for them to do it because they're not really interested. They're not so interested in the P-46 anymore. So really kind of everyone's happy. Probably not North American. North Americans, to them it was a bit of a waste of money. And again, this narrative at the time has come that, they didn't get anything from this Curtiss information. And yet the sources from Curtiss say, aha, you copied the P-46. Because you got this data, and there are superficial similarities between the P-46 and the Mustang. Superficial is as far as it gets. It's really, the radiator was in the back of the fuselage in the P-46 in the way that it was in the Mustang. But when you drill down into the detail of it, and really, the beauty of the Mustang was it had this really careful design to every element of it, the attention to detail. And, they really worked out the details of the aerodynamics of this radiator tunnel in the rear fuselage, which gave them the Meredith effect. The Curtiss example was a lot less sophisticated. They weren't really working on those principles. But anyway, so that's another little myth that you get about the P-51, that people associated with Curtiss subsequently said, oh, we were robbed. And you get these lines that they say, this sort of, well, the P-46, because they were allowed to finish making the prototype, and that came out a little while later. And Curtiss people were saying, oh, well, when we were allowed to fly the P-46, it was as good as the Mustang. It wasn't. It was 30 miles an hour slower. It was not a terribly good aeroplane. And this was sort of the story of Curtiss really throughout the Second World War. So they spent the entire war trying to come up with an improvement on the P-40 and couldn't, which is sort of, for a company of that size and experience is remarkable really. But that's kind of a side issue to this story here.
So first flight is on the 6th of October 1940. Amazingly, it's sort of into RAF production by April 1941. What is this aircraft that we have in our mind, if you think about it, probably Ray Hanna flying by Christian Bale in that definitive D spec with the 650 calibers. What is actually the aircraft that we have that the RAF would go on to call the Mark I?
So the Mustang Mark I is, so it has an Allison V1710 V12 engine. It's a high back Mustang, so it has the original high back fuselage with the side opening canopy. 3-bladed propeller. It has a rather odd armament because the British want 8 guns, because 8 guns is what the British do at this point. The British are working on 303s, 303 caliber machine guns, whereas the Americans have the 30 caliber and the 50 caliber. The 30 caliber, it's not a great gun. It's prone to jams. The 303 has had sort of the British version of it has had some improvements which make it into a reliable weapon. And then you have the 50 cal, which is kind of the definitive medium caliber gun of the war. It's a very good weapon. I actually don't know why they chose to include 50s in the mix, but you have this slightly weird situation of 4 50 caliber and 4 30 caliber guns in the same aeroplane, which is kind of a little bit idiosyncratic, but it's I presume it's kind of, the British want 8 guns. 8 50s is ludicrous by those standards. Obviously, later on, the P-47 will have 8 50s, but it's a heavy gun. So
the P-47's got the room for 8 guns.
Yeah, and the engine power for it and things like that. So and it's a slightly odd arrangement. So you've got one pair of 50s in the wing, and 2 pairs of 30s, and 1 pair of 50s in the chin position underneath the engine. So I suppose when you think about it, a V12 engine, a good place to put guns is by the the crankcase. When you think about it, it's the same as the BF-109. It's just that has its engine upside down, so it has its guns on the top. We have this rather unusual. I can't think of any other fighter that had its guns in the same position as the Mustang Mark One. This odd kind of 2 gun barrels sticking out of the chin of the Mustang, which is sort of a an unusual thing, synchronized to fire through the prop disc. Yeah, I mean, other than that, I mean, it looks quite different to that definitive D model that you mentioned earlier. It has different lines around the forward fuselage. It has that high back with the sort of quite heavily framed canopy, which is sort of something you associate with earlier war aircraft. But the fundamentals of it are the same. The aerodynamics are the same. It has a shallower scoop because obviously the big thing about the later Merlin model Mustangs is that real kind of pregnant belly that they have, and a kind of great big gaping scoop, which actually is a lot neater on the Allison engined aircraft because it had a smaller radiator. It looks quite a lot different, but in its fundamentals is basically the same airplane. They managed to fit 6 50 calibers into the wing in the D model, which was basically through changes to the feed mechanism. There was no change to the shape of the wing. It didn't need bumps on the wing like like the British were fond of doing with their aircraft. Yeah, so that was it. It was the engine about just over 1,000 horsepower. So you're talking sort of the early Merlin kind of sort of levels of power. And this is in 1942. So the engine's starting to look a little bit outmoded in terms of its pure performance.
And vitally, that single stage supercharger.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, single stage supercharger, which gives it its maximum performance. You can choose one altitude that it gets its maximum performance out, and everything else is a compromise. And I think off the top of my head for the Mustang Mark One, it's about 12,000 feet. 12,000 feet, which is not great by 1941-42 standards. But when the prototype first appears, that's again an issue that the early signs are promising, but there are a few little difficulties, particularly again with that engine. They can't run the engine at full throttle to start with, which is something that puzzles them for a short period of time. And then the first prototype crashes, or rather, it has an engine failure and it turns over on landing, and they have to rebuild it. And this is this could be there are other programs where they lose the first prototype and that basically kills the program. So there was a bit of luck involved that things kept going, but they realized that actually the issue with the engine was the carburetor scoop. And one of the characteristic features of the early Mustangs, the Allison engined ones, is this long scoop that you see, an air scoop on the top of the engine, on the top of the cowling, with its intake just behind the propeller. And you see this on the P40s, and you see it on the early Mustangs as well. And it's something that's a little bit unusual to our eyes in British circles, because we're used to the Merlin with its updraft carburetor and the scoop underneath, so where it's nice and unobtrusive and you don't tend to see it. They discovered that was too short. It's a shame because it's a real sort of space age design. You see the mock-up of the aircraft, and this scoop, it terminates about halfway along the cowling, and it's cut back, it's sort of raked back. And and it looks all modern and a little bit Flash Gordon in there, but they decided that wasn't really working. So you got something that was quite a lot more practical, but not quite so pretty. That end up with this sort of this long bit of trunking along the top of the cowling.
Those early Mustangs, when you compare it to say the B model, the first Merlin engine one, it seems the Allison ones are slightly more top heavy, like you're saying, with the pregnant radiator on the top, because with the B you get the Malcolm hood and everything gets a little bit more compact on the top.
Yeah, and there's a slimmer nose, and that was one of the things actually where, you know, one of the reasons I think why the Allison Mustang hasn't had its praises sung so much as the Merlin one is that North American really didn't have a very good relationship with Allison, and they did with Packard and Rolls-Royce. Packard and Rolls-Royce were prepared to make sort of slight changes and to accommodate North American and meet them halfway. You know, Allison were rather, you know, this is your engine, take it or leave it. And they made some changes to, I think it was possibly the wiring loom or something along those lines, before they handed over the first engine to North American. And when North American received this engine, they realized that their carefully designed cowlings didn't fit, because Allison had made this change to the engine and hadn't told them about it. So they had to then compromise the shape. This is why when you look at the Allison Mustang in its nose area, it has a bit of an angle underneath. And, you know, it's a little bit angular where the cowling kind of comes along straight and then it sort of angles up to the propeller. And this is, we think, you know, partly why it was that they had to redesign it at sort of fairly short notice just to accommodate the engine. Yeah, so you have the situation where it's you know, you've got this Allison engine, just over 1,000 horsepower. You've got your 8 guns, which is what the RAF asked for. You know, and actually, once the testing properly starts to get into gear, you've got a very healthy performance. You know, it's sort of knocking on 400 miles an hour, and you know, it's got one thing that it has got that the RAF have been lacking is it's got a phenomenal endurance. It's got a really, really big range, you know, compared to the typical RAF interceptor style fighters. It's got like 3 or 4 times the range that that these aircraft have. And that's something that by the time because the war's moving on quickly, you know, when they first express interest in this aircraft, the Battle of France is still going on. When the prototype first arrives, the Battle of Britain is happening. By the time they're in production, you're more into a sort of fighter sweeps into into occupied Germany. And by the time then, you know, it's in volume production and the RAF has started to receive aircraft. You know, you've got to the point where the fighter sweeps and the sort of ramrods and circuses and things like that have had horrific losses, and the RAF is kind of moving away from those. So, you know, the ground is moving under the Mustang's feet the whole time it's in development. And even though you've got this, you know, really remarkably quick development by the standards of the time, it's still, the war has moved on from where the RAF were when they ordered it. And so, you know, you have the situation that actually, when it arrives, you've got a situation where you've got a fighter that's good up to about 12,000 feet. And then above that, the engine, which doesn't quite have the amount of power, and crucially, it delivers its power too low. Partly to do with the nature of the aircraft. It's partly because of the way it's constructed and some of those developments. It's quite a heavy airframe by the standards. You know, American airframes tend to be heavier than British ones anyway, but, you know, it's a heavy airframe. And actually, the one downside of it is its climb rate, you know, and its critical altitude. It's slow at altitude and it's slow to get there, which is a bit of an issue to the RAF at the time, which, you know, air combat has been getting higher and higher and higher. At the time it arrives in RAF hands, you know, you're looking at the F model of the BF 109, and you know, the kind of combat that the RAF is involved in. They've got their, you know, Spitfire Mark 5s with the Merlin 45, which delivers its, you know, its critical power at quite a good altitude. And you know, the Mustang suddenly doesn't fit into what the RAF needs for a day fighter in Northern Europe.
So the aircraft that the RAF have received is not exactly what it needs at that time. But what's the American perspective on it? Because they've not been ignoring the development of it. They've been following the Mustang quite closely.
Yeah, and I think this is another one of those big myths that the slow-moving American government machine initially ignored the Mustang despite all its promise, and it took time for it to realize what a brilliant aircraft it had on its hands. Actually, the US, the material division of the Air Force has been really paying quite close attention to the work that that Shmurd's doing at North American, and they're very interested in the laminar wing. There's even a point at which there's a debate as to whether, well, should we should we allow the export of this aircraft to the British, because it is new technology and it's something that we're very interested in. And again, they come to the conclusion that that they want to see how this thing performs in the real world and in real world combat conditions, and then they realize that actually, if they get the British to do the donkey work of proving this aircraft and this technology, then the America is the winner. And so there's this sort of myth that they didn't pay attention to it. Part of the contract that the British had was that from the first production line, they had to hand over 2 aircraft from the first 10 production machines to the US, which they did, and those were the aircraft that became the XP-51 aircraft, of which one still exists. And I think partly where that story came from is that when those aircraft arrived at the US testing facility at Wright Field, I think it was, they weren't tested immediately, and there was a little bit of delay before they were actually put into use. But you consider the situation that the Air Force, the Air Corps, has at this time, which is that it's gearing up for a big modernization, a big expansion, rearmament, and it has its aircraft that it was expecting to rely on. So the P-47 being the big one, so that takes priority with the testing. But that's like in Britain as with the Lancaster and the Halifax. For a while there was a sense that, well, Lancaster's coming along, it looks promising, but the Halifax is the thing that we've bet the farm on at the moment, so we need to prioritize that. And that was as it was with the P-47. But the Americans, they did get to the XP-51 and they tested them thoroughly, and they were very impressed. The testing reports are very complimentary, very favorable, about all kinds of aspects of the aircraft, about how easy it was to fly, about how easy it was for a rookie pilot to get into it and be instantly familiar with it, which is another huge thing with these expansion programs. You're putting pilots with relatively little training into the front line quite quickly, because that's what you have to do. And the Mustang is an aircraft that you can put them in and they'll feel confident and they'll be able to get the most out of. So you've got all these aspects of the Mustang, which it has these very modern, high performance characteristics. It's very practical in terms of its build. It's very easy to mass produce because that's the way Edgar Schmoyer designed it. And it's easy for pilots to get hold of and to get the most out of easily. So it's a very, even though it has these compromises in terms of the RAF experience, which we were just talking about, there's an awful lot going for the Mustang as it originally appears, and and the Americans realize that, and they understand that, and they actually quite quickly place an order for aircraft for themselves. Now that's kind of a controversial issue in itself, because the first major order they place for it is as an attack aircraft, not as a fighter. But we'll get to that element of it, I'm sure. But and that's down the line, that's another angle where people have said, the US government, because they're because we don't trust the government and they're a big lumbering monolithic organization and all that kind of stuff, they didn't recognize this brilliant aircraft that this tiny little agile startup had created. And it's the American dream. That's how it went in America. They were very interested in it. They were very interested in its technology. They were interested in seeing it proven in combat. And they were interested in ordering it for their own air forces. It's just that they weren't things in wartime, production in wartime. They weren't quite in the war yet, but there was an understanding that they probably would be. Certainly, they were going to be gearing up to those sorts of levels of production. And, this is a super tanker. You can't turn it around immediately. They placed a certain amount on the P-47, on the P-40, and you've got this new aircraft turning up that they know about, they're aware of its potential strengths, but you can't just turn the ship just like that. So it has to kind of find its way in, and it takes time to do so. But they were aware of it, they were interested in it, they were actually very excited about the possibilities.
I could quite happily talk about the development and the nuance of the Mustang design for the whole of this podcast, but let's get into some operations here. So 26 Squadron's the first one to get its hands on it, and it goes into an interesting role which is perfectly suited for us, the Army cooperation role in the tactical reconnaissance element, where the legs of the aircraft are going to be vital for that. So let's talk about that initial year 1942, because its debut is on a rather, speaking as a Canadian, inauspicious day.
Well, just to sort of start about just to talk a little bit about how it ended up with in that role to start off with, which is there was an organization had been formed after after the Battle of France and the failure of the Army cooperation, aircraft in the Army cooperation role, and how that hadn't, everything they thought they knew about Army cooperation had turned out to be false. And they had the aircraft like the Westland Lysander, which was inadequate for operation in the presence of the enemy, and they were using things like ferry battles and so on for the tactical reconnaissance, which again is unescorted in areas where you don't have air superiority. It's not going to really work.
Very, very, very polite way of talking about the ferry battle.
It was a bloodbath. So they quickly revise everything they think they know about Army cooperation, and this is another one of these things. Army cooperation is kind of seen to be like this niche role and this kind of little kind of corner of the RAF that guys are doing, working with the Army, and it's not really bomber command, fighter command kind of stuff. Whereas when you think about the Royal Flying Corps on the Western Front in the First World War, it was pretty much entirely an Army cooperation outfit. That was really its raison d'etre. It was working with the Army. It was working in concert with the Army, and so after the Battle of France, they realized that actually what they need for Army cooperation aircraft is aircraft that first and foremost can survive where the enemy has air superiority. So you need something with a good performance. You need something that can tackle enemy fighters when it comes across them. And, so you have these roles of tactical reconnaissance where they go in and, are getting the real-time information on the battlefield and, what the enemy is doing and where the eyes on the ground can't see. And you also have, a sort of like a ground support role. You have a sort of hampering enemy communications role, and you have a little bit of a sort of interdiction role, which is sort of trying to hamper the enemy getting their supplies onto the supplies and reinforcements onto the battlefield. So you have all these sort of all these roles are working directly with the Army that actually when you add them up, they're quite a major thing. And certainly when you're getting to the tactical air forces later on, it becomes a huge part of the war. We tend to look at North Africa and the Western Desert as the birth of this form of Army cooperation. It's not called Army cooperation by then, but that's what it is this tactical battlefield mode of air combat. But a big part of the nucleus of that is what Army Cooperation Command is doing with the Mustangs over Northern Europe in 1942, 1943, 1944, before the invasion. And its baptism of fire with the Mustang is, as you alluded to it, is the raid on Dieppe, which was this attempt to see if it was possible for an amphibious force to seize a port and hold it for a period of time in order to bring more forces and supplies ashore. And they decided to try this with the port of Dieppe. It wasn't an invasion. It was just, they didn't intend to make it a foothold. They just wanted to see if it was possible. Because, you had, even in 1942, there were plans for invasions of Northern Europe and other places that, particularly when the Americans got into the war, they were really champing at the bit of, we need to be going in and invading. So Operation... You'll tell me what it was.
Sledgehammer.
No. Sledgehammer.
Sledgehammer in Cherbourg.
Oh yeah, right. Yeah,
which is mad. Take the peninsula, hold it for a month, and then leave.
Yeah,
and then Dieppe's Jubilee, isn't it?
Yeah. Jubilee. That's the one. That's the one. But yeah, so Operation Jubilee was really this kind of proof of concept thing of I think a sort of British skepticism over the practicality of doing an invasion early, and American enthusiasm and so on. So there was like, right, we're going to go see if we can hold a port, seize a port and hold it. And obviously, Canadian divisions and Canadian squadrons of the that were part of Army Cooperation Command were actually, a big part of this. So air cover is crucial. Tactical reconnaissance is crucial because you need to know what the enemy's doing with regard to what forces they're bringing up, how well the forward units are doing at holding them back and things like that. So the particularly the Canadian squadrons, they're thinking they've been training for months on end. They want to get into the fight, and they have the chance during Operation Jubilee. And their role is not to be air to air. Their role is to be going into enemy-held territory, finding out what's going on the ground. Taking photographs, because the Mustangs by this time they have modifications that allow them to carry an oblique camera, to go in at low level, take photographs, and obviously the pilots are crucial to this as well, because most of what the intelligence is coming from the pilot. They're having to go in at high speed over enemy territory, form an accurate picture of what's going on, and bring that back. And in doing so, there's an American called Hollis Hills who's flying with the RCAF at this point. They tangle with some Focke-Wulf 190s, and he shoots one of them down. And this is the first aerial kill for the Mustang. A Canadian squadron, an American pilot flying an American aircraft ordered by the British within a British Air Force. So it's a pretty multinational effort. And that's not what they're there for. They're not there to be tangling with enemy fighters, but the enemy fighters are trying to stop them doing their Army cooperation work. And they're able to survive in that battle space. They do lose some aircraft, but they're able to do the job and do the job that's required of them. And it's really proof that giving the Mustang to Army Cooperation Command was what they needed, and they really kind of start to develop into this cohesive, really expert force. And just to sort of quickly go back to the origins of this, after they lose the Lysanders, the first aircraft that they try to equip Army Cooperation Squadrons with is the early models of the Tomahawk, the P-40 in American parlance, but it's the Curtiss Tomahawk. They don't manage to do that, partly because there are demands on Tomahawk from other places, from the Middle East, not Middle East, sorry, North Africa, that kind of way, and other theatres for acting as a fighter. Awful reliability with the engines, particularly with these early model Allisons, with their they've got this odd reduction gear that doesn't really work, and keeps breaking up. They have terrible serviceability, and they're not able to build up the squadrons in the way they want, and to get the training in, and to get the pilots skilled. So when the Mustang comes along, the RAF didn't quite know what to do with it. There was at one point it looked as though they might just be transferring them all to Russia. There were possibilities of doing. They even looked at giving them to China. There was a sort of an element of the RAF that really thought, we don't want these things. But at the same time, it was recognised that they're going to be getting these supplies of these aircraft, whether they ordered, whatever they choose to do with them. The P-40 hadn't worked out. They had to try and concentrate the P-40 on the squadrons in North Africa. So they had this idea: we'll reserve the Mustang entirely for Army Cooperation Command, and we will make those fighter reconnaissance squadrons of Army Cooperation Command entirely a Mustang force. And this works out remarkably well, because it means, the spares operation, that's just, they get priority for that. They get all the airframes. There's modifications of the airframes for British service. You've only got one state of modification, which is the fighter reconnaissance modification, and it just works. And it's the perfect aircraft for this role, because it's fast at low level, it's tough. It has this long range. The Allison engine actually works really well in this regime, particularly in its F model with this better reduction gear. And the one big advantage, it's actually, it's kind of a remarkable engine. It's a little bit more modern than the Merlin in some ways. It's got about half the moving parts of a Merlin. It's really quite a sort of, it has this kind of simplicity and producibility that they were doing in America at the time. The Merlin is this kind of jewel-like thing that's made by craftsmen in sheds. The V1710 is this kind of wonderful identikit modular thing that they can make in car factories and do whatever with.
It's a Rolex and a Casio.
Pretty much, yeah. Is it?
Oh, it's probably not too fair.
Yeah, okay. Let's yeah. But that's not a bad, because your Casio is perfectly reliable and does what you want it to do. But so there it is. Maybe a Seiko, but so there it is, and it works. And the one huge advantage of the Allison is it works really well and smoothly at low RPM. So it can be brought down to low RPM, and this really stretches out the range that it's got. So you've got these aircraft without external fuel tanks, any kind of overload fuel, that can fly from the UK into Germany. And this is something that British fighter pilots who've been used to having one eye on the fuel gauge, it's really new to them to have an aircraft that can just go so far. And it's got a fast cruise as well, so it's because of this high aerodynamic efficiency and this low drag airframe that it's got, that it fits, it works all in all kinds of ways, and it works well in this sort of low level hit and run warfare that Army Cooperation Command is developing. And they actually sort of turn what was intended as like a reconnaissance aircraft with a bit of ability to hit back if they're bounced, and they turn it into something that actually has quite a major offensive role, just with again, without hanging any bombs off it or rockets or even cannon. They're able to be really quite destructive of Axis communications all over occupied France, Holland, Germany. In particular, train busting is a thing that they do, because 50 cal machine guns against a train is actually quite effective. You can burst the boiler with a few rounds of 50 cal. They were finding that if you burst the boiler on a train, it blows the fire out of the firebox into the cab, and train drivers aren't very fond of that happening, to the extent where Allied intelligence reports were saying that in occupied France, the Germans were starting to struggle to recruit train drivers because of all the train busting that was going on, and the sort of rather dangerous position that they were in if they were driving trains across across France, and even into sort of Belgium, Holland, Germany even. And they were doing this kind of hit and run raids all over, all the same time as while gathering intelligence and taking photographs and making a real nuisance of themselves, when it was the only kind of daylight raiding that the Allies were able to do over the occupied countries. Obviously they were sending bombers over at night, but nothing really but a Mustang at this point was capable of surviving so far into occupied territory and making and doing some harm and coming back.
Let's jump ahead to the other theatre where its legend starts to be solidified, which is North Africa. it's an interesting role it has in
Yeah.
those days before, say, Sicily and Italy, because this is the point where they do start hanging things off the bottom of it,
Yeah.
and you do have the slightly tricky nomenclature issues because you also have the A-36 in the
Yeah.
theatre as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the first US squadrons in North Africa are tactical reconnaissance squadrons. The Americans have learned very well from the British experience, and the first Mustangs they acquire are actually Mustangs that are held back from a British order. The British have been trying to get cannons on these things ever since the early days of them ordering them, and the American production of cannons is not going well. And they finally get this model, which is the North American Model 91, which is known to the British as the Mustang Mark 1A, which is pretty much a Mustang Mark 1, but it's got 4 20mm cannon on the wings, which is by now the standard fighter armament. And the Americans call these things P-51, no suffix, which is really confusing because, P-51 is used as a generic term, but it's also the specific term for these particular 54 they had of them, Mustangs, which are the first ones, and they fit them out as tactical reconnaissance aircraft with using the lessons very much of the British experience with an oblique camera. They also add a vertical camera under the fuselage, which then goes back to the British, and the British start using that attachment. And they're doing the same kind of work in North Africa. But then, hot on the heels of these early fighter reconnaissance Mustangs, is this model called the A-36, which is the first Mustang that the Americans actually order for themselves. And this thing really, again, it doubles down on the low-level role. They've got a different model of Allison in there, which gives its maximum power at 3,500 feet. So it's total low-level specialist. And this goes back really quite a long time into the sort of dive bomber, debate in the Army and the Navy, which, again, I won't go into. We go into this in the book. I recommend read the book for all the background on this because it's fascinating background, but it's an awful lot of not Mustangs before you get to Mustang. And really, right in the late of the day, the Americans realize that the dive bombers they have and that they're developing are not going to be survivable in the battle space. They're not going to have the performance. So Dutch Kindleberger, him again, turns up, says to the Army Air Force, look, we've got this aircraft that performs, it's a hot rod at low level. It can carry a lot of weight, which we know because we fill it full of massive amounts of fuel. And it can carry a lot of stuff without really degrading its performance too much. We can fit this thing out as an attack aircraft, and we can get it to you in double quick time. And Dutch Kindleberger is very interested in this because it keeps the Mustang production line open. Because we've got a slight issue where the US, now being in the war in early 1942, they're suddenly rushing to catch up, and they want bombers, they want B-25s by the 1,000. The British have their orders for the Mustang, and the British want more Mustangs, but the US are by this time saying, look, we have priority over orders. So by selling this attack version of the Mustang, Dutch Kindleberger is able to keep the Mustang production line alive, and that's what he's chiefly interested in doing. The interesting thing about the attack version of the Mustang is they propose all kinds of stuff for this aircraft. There's a version which has 37mm cannon in the wings, like the tank busting Hurricane Mark 2D. And I'd have loved to have seen this actually, because it's a really kind of neat installation. There's a slight bulge under the wing, but this whole thing is buried in the wing. And just to go back to that laminar flow wing again, the beauty of it is the Spitfire gets all its performance from having a very, very thin wing. The laminar flow wing can get the same kind of performance and be much thicker. So you then have structural benefits, you have space benefits, you can fit more fuel in it, you can fit more weapons in it. But the Army decide they don't want this massive 37mm cannon, but they do want bombs and they do want dive brakes. Which, because you've got the American obsession with the dive bomber at this point, it's something that through the sort of 20s and 30s, they're mad keen on dive bombing, particularly the US Navy. And it's this phenomenally accurate way of delivering weapons onto a target. And you've had the Stuka early in the war. For a while, everyone's rushing to get a dive bomber. and that dies out quite quickly. But you've got this really high performance aircraft, and they decide to put dive brakes on the wings, which kind of messes up the laminar flow to an extent, but North American's able to make it work. And it doesn't really degrade its performance as a fighter. You've still got 6 50 cal guns in this. So they've got 4 in the wings and 2 in the chin position. And you can hang up to a 500-pound bomb off each wing. You don't need a swinging crutch or anything like that, like the Stuka has, because you've got the bombs on the wings, so they're not going to hit the prop on the way down. You can do vertical dives with this thing, absolute pinpoint accuracy, and it's like the Typhoon and the F-35. There's a swing roll aircraft. It can fight its way to the target. It can deliver its weapons on target, and it can act as a fighter on the way out. It's a remarkable machine. As long as you stay at low level, you're fine. Anything much above 10,000, and the A36 is kind of it's not very happy anymore.
You would be hard pressed to spot the difference, really, with the A36 unless you knew what you were
exactly. Yeah. I mean,
it's a very, very clean installation.
Yeah. I mean, it's there are photos of the A36 from certain angles, and you wouldn't tell it from an early model Mustang. It doesn't have the sort of lumps and bumps on that most dive bombers of the time. The competition is things like the other things the Army has are things like the A31, which is their version of the Vultee Vengeance, which the British and the Indian Air Force and the Australians use with some success in Burma, but it's still it needs fighter escort really. And the A25, which is a sort of a denavalized version of the SB2C Helldiver, which again was sort of massively troubled development, but also it didn't have the kind of performance that could live in against enemy fighters unless you had a heavy fighter escort. So the A36 was this really sort of one of a kind fighter bomber in that it could do steep dives, which other fighters later in the war, when they sort of hung bombs off them, were very, very effective, but you couldn't maybe do more than a sort of 45-degree dive. And the A36 is incredibly versatile because you could use it as a fighter. It was used successfully as a long range escort to medium bombers in the Mediterranean theater. When they were doing the assault on Sicily and the other islands, and then on the Italian mainland. It was used as a tactical reconnaissance aircraft. It could be, because it could have the same camera installation as the tactical reconnaissance Mustang. So you could just bolt these things on and go and use it as a tactical reconnaissance aircraft, which the RAF did. They borrowed a series of A36s from the Americans and used them in tactical reconnaissance in the Mediterranean. And and the Americans used them in the same role. It was it's this remarkable aircraft that just very little is written about. And can we just hear, while we're on the A36, 2 words about the Apache name, which is completely fallacious. It was never applied to the A36 before, we think, the 1970s. There's a chap called Michael Verassi who sadly died a couple of years ago, did an immense amount of work on this, and he went through reams and reams of paperwork and could not come up with any connection between the Apache name and the A36 aircraft before the 1970s. Where he believed it started was an issue of Air Classics in the mid 1970s, and then that got passed on to a Squadron Signal title, and from then on, it just gathered momentum, and to the extent where you had museums putting signage on their A36s, calling it A36 Apache, because they felt by then that nobody would know what this aircraft was that didn't have that name on it. And a guy called Tom Griffiths, who's sort of he runs the Facebook P-51 group, has had this long correspondence with the USAF museum to try and get them to change the signage on their A36, which they have now done. Which credit to Tom for his persistence to do that. The name Apache, well, again, this is probably it's not the time or place to go into, but it was at one point North Americans' favoured name for the Mustang, but it was out of the picture by the time the A36 came along. And there's some debate over whether or when it was applied officially to early models of Mustang, but on the American side. When they were trying to sell it to the Americans, they were calling it Apache in there. So you'll find adverts, magazine adverts, talking about the North American Apache, but that's not the A36. That's earlier models. Anyway, so you had two attack groups by this time that were fully equipped with the A36. So 6 squadrons of it in the Mediterranean theatre, and they were quite a major part of the initial drive. The invasion of Sicily, the conquest of Sicily, and then the Allied drive into Italy itself. And they played quite a crucial role in that, which I think is fairly underappreciated these days.
And again, the range comes into it again, because they're able to quite happily operate from Tunisia, whereas a lot of the other aircraft couldn't. Where Malta was basically that aircraft carrier, and the Mustangs were just happily trundling across the Med doing their thing.
Yeah, absolutely so. And there were they were based in North Africa and staging across to Sicily and the other islands, and they were able to do this without any external fuel tanks, even just on the internal fuel, which is handy, because you can hang bombs off it, and you don't need the space for a fuel tank.
Which was the great issue with the Typhoon, was as soon as it needed to go any decent amount of distance, you had to take 4 rockets off it or 1 bomb.
Yeah, and that's the thing I never understood about the Typhoon, because the thing is huge. There must be loads of room for fuel. What are they doing with all that internal space? But that's probably a story for another time.
Yes, we can geek out about that another time. Yeah. But let's race ahead. One of the things that, when we're talking about Dieppe and that oblique cameras, those low level images of the battle at Dieppe are really impressive. We're talking to David O'Keefe next week about his work on Dieppe, and in his book he's got lots of those images.
Yeah.
And the thing that a lot of people will know or have seen in books about D-Day are low-level images of the battles going on the beach. And those were the TACR Mustangs flying a crazy number of missions on the 6th of June. And beforehand, especially with the no-ball missions against the V1 sites in the months beforehand.
They had so many roles that involved directly in D-Day. So first off, they were both British and American Allison Mustang tactical reconnaissance squadrons were heavily involved in photographing the entire coast and all the coastal defenses, and building up just that detailed picture of the defenses in order that the invasion could happen at all. In order to do that and not give away the game as to where the invasion was going to hit, they had to actually photograph much larger stretches of coast than they needed. But they were able to do this. And we're talking about a small number of airframes by this time. And importance is sort of well out of proportion to the number of aircraft there were. And then there were several Allison Mustang squadrons that were involved in gunnery spotting for the Royal Navy and US Navy heavy warships. So they were training in the weeks coming up to D-Day, familiarizing themselves with the ships and actually building up this close working relationship. And from a small single seat fighter aircraft, directing the guns of a battleship onto specific targets, and then once they'd finished that, gained a bit of a beachhead and destroyed sort of massing counterattacks and things like that, then they switched to their tactical reconnaissance role. And there were other squadrons that were doing tactical reconnaissance on the whole day, so they were doing their gunnery spotting and then switching halfway through the day to TACR. And like you say, it was a critical job, and getting those pictures, those oblique photographs, is you think, well, how low were they flying, and the speed they were flying as well, and to be able to get that sort of precise photography of a particular target is just sort of astonishing, really. But it's a lot of it is down to the training of the pilots and the skill of the pilots and the skill of the planning as well. Because, one thing we haven't talked about is just the planning of these missions was incredibly done in minute detail. And, that was a big part of its success. But the quality of the aircraft was the other fact. At this point, when the RAF was starting to run out of Allison Mustang airframes, it was looking into what could conceivably replace it, and reluctantly came to the conclusion that the best thing to replace an Allison Mustang was another Allison Mustang. But it was unfortunate that at this point they were going to have to find something else to try and do that job, but there really was nothing else with the speed, the range, the stability at low level, the maneuverability at low level, the sort of the survivability of it, the economy and all those factors. There was just nothing else that quite matched there were aircraft that matched the Allison Mustang on certain aspects of that, but there was no other aircraft that matched it on everything.
Just on the planning bit, one of the bits I found fascinating in your book is just how minutely timed those missions were, so that they would more than one aircraft would converge on a target or a photo op just at the right moment, so as to show up where they were going or what they were doing.
Yeah,
it's remarkable, because you just sort of think, all right, we're going down there, we're going to take some pictures and then we'll shoot some stuff up coming back. But a hell of a lot more goes into it than
massively. Yeah, I mean, they had these sort of very precise zigzags planned, so that each leg of the zigzag was planned to be a sufficient length that by the time the position and course and speed of the aircraft had been noted and passed on, the aircraft was now on a significantly different course. So when the interception was called, it went to the wrong place. So they were, doing this in order to dodge the enemy defenses. You think of it as like this sort of free-ranging mission to go and shoot up trains or motor transport or whatever, but actually they were planned to hit a road or a railway or a canal or whatever at a particular point at a particular time from a particular direction, and then they would sort of fly along they would kind of merge parallel with the railway or whatever, and then hop over to be on the railway that would be in opposite direction to the prevailing traffic there. So you'd meet a train head on, pepper that, cut away before you get to a station, because stations hide flak traps. And another thing that fascinated me about the Allison Mustang story, really, the whole thing, was how much kind of cross-pollination there was between different arms of different air arms. And they were learning this stuff in the British and Canadian squadrons that was then filtering through to the American squadrons, and then other British squadrons in the Med. And then there was sort of American experiences in the Med that were then filtering back to the British squadrons. And there were, it was really, they were, and then, out into China, Burma, India. But there was one particular incident from the Med where they were doing this rhubarb type mission, where it's sort of armed reconnaissance mission, where there were 4, I think, A36s doing this mission, which was very, very similar to the ones that the British were doing in over France, Germany, and so on. They kind of came along a railway track, a troop train coming the other way, so they absolutely riddled that and moving, just come up to a station. And they even have they sort of plan it in such a way that the first aircraft to go in will fire on the target and then move aside for the other aircraft to come through and then hit the same target. So, and the reasoning for this is so no aircraft ends up running down its ammunition more than any other. So if they do then run into trouble, each aircraft has a reserve of ammunition, and they thought through this stuff and they worked it out. But they happened to hit. There was an ammo dump at this station that they weren't expecting. They were firing on it, and then explosion. The flames were seen approximately 3,000 feet into the air. One of the Mustangs just flies right into this and just doesn't have a chance. One of the aircraft that's alongside, has the whole of the sort of side of the aircraft stove in. The whole airframe's bent like a banana. The guy's trying to fly with the cockpit canopy over his arms because it's been blown out, and he manages to get it back to the airfield and make a safe landing. Actually, the mission was quite similar in various parts of Europe and even off into the Far East, and they were using this knowledge to sort of build and make the air forces more and more effective.
So to wrap up, because we've been nattering for quite a while.
Yeah, sorry about that.
No, this is I've loved it. I'm sure the AV geeks of the History Hack clan will be loving it as well. So I guess we can say really that the aircraft's operational life petered out, not mainly because it wasn't a good aircraft. it was just basically that the design had moved on. The requirement to have the Mustang as a long range aircraft superseded this continuing need that was there for the entire conflict to have this rather robust, very long range, very fast ground attack aircraft that had the rest of the war just moved on from.
Yeah, I mean, somewhat. I mean, I think the in an ideal world, I think both the British and the Americans would have had more Allison Mustangs, throughout the war. And just sort of a word here about the P-51A, which was the sort of definitive Allison Mustang Mark II in RAF service, which had a further developed version of the Allison, which still had a single stage supercharger, but was it was more powerful, and it delivered its power somewhat higher. So it was a good low and medium altitude fighter, and probably on about equal terms with, say, the Tempest, something like that, in terms of its the sort of altitude profile. It was just worked out that really there was too much difference between the Allison Mustang and the Merlin Mustang. It needed too many changes to its airframe to fit the Merlin in effectively, to have two parallel production lines. The important aircraft to have for the major war effort was the Merlin one, so the Allison one was sacrificed. It was in slightly more niche roles than the Merlin one. I mean, let's face it, it was a better fighter bomber than the Merlin Mustang. Not that the Merlin Mustang was a bad fighter bomber. It was, it did very well in that role, but the Allison aircraft was more ideally suited to that, and it was useful in the Far East, but again, they were just running out of airframes by that time, and the production priorities went with the Merlin one. But which was again, I think there's this idea that because the Allison Mustang was superseded, that meant that that it was outmoded, which it wasn't. I think, given the choice, and there is documentary evidence that both the British and Americans would have liked to continue with both. But unfortunately, from a production perspective, it wasn't possible to do that. They were around until the end of the war, and really it was just practicalities that saw them put to one side. You never get the perfect aircraft for every role. You always have to make do. And in this case, there was a trade-off. They needed the Merlin Mustang more at that particular point during the war, and that's the way it happened. But then who's to say that actually, to TAF with more squadrons of Mustang Mark IIs, and in the Pacific, more squadrons of P-51As wouldn't have actually done a great job when they were doing that ground attack and also low level fighter bomber free ranging kind of thing that was really quite important in the later part of the war. So I think we shouldn't do the Allison Mustang down in that regard.
And you sort of think as well that additional loiter that the Allison Mustangs had, especially in the environment that TUTAF would be operating in sort of late 44, trying to keep up with the advance, probably would have been vital, because the heavier aircraft had to operate from places they shouldn't have been. The Typhoon, for example, from rather rough and muddy strips, just to keep them within range, whereas you could have the Mustang back on those rather empty purpose-built fields in England doing the same job.
Yeah, and even then, when you do need to operate from temporary airstrips, the Mustangs, it does so a little bit better than those, because there were, when the Mustang started to get replaced with the P-47 in the Med, they found all kinds of trouble with, the P-47 can lug 1,000-pounder on each wing, but we need a concrete runway. It was certainly when the weather turned bad, the Mustang was more versatile in terms of where it could operate from as well. So there are options that it gives you that you don't necessarily have with other aircraft. But unfortunately, that'll always be a bit of a what if, because they didn't have the numbers of aircraft at that point in the war.
What a great place to end on a fun counterfactual.
Yeah. I always love a what if.
Matt, that's been absolutely fantastic, and I think your book is equally fascinating in that the things we've only touched on here, that you go into some superb depth, and to show that the myth busting in this case is needed, because this was a fantastic aircraft that did, a job as long as the airframes were around to do it. It wasn't replaced, and there wasn't a need for it to be replaced as such. They just ran out of them.
Yeah, and that's the sad truth. And thanks ever so much for giving me the opportunity to witter on about it, because I say it's something I've sort of come quite evangelical about. And also I think, just in terms of unsung heroes, I just want to mention here Bob Sickle, who really, without him, the book wouldn't have happened. He's sort of, I met him through the P-51 SIG. I mean, he's an expert on not just Mustangs. He knows way more about the RAF than I do, and so on. He's based over in New England rather than the proper one. He won't like me for that. But yeah, I mean, so big shout out to Bob. Thanks to Bob, who's did masses of research, editing on the book, and also really just the main thing was just asking the questions, like kept pushing me in terms of assumptions that I'd made when I was writing a bit of it, and just, are you sure about that? What about X, Y, and Z? And pushing me to look at the context and the wider context. And I think that's where the story comes in, is that you can look at the thing in isolation, but when you fit it into the context of the war and the development, that's when you start to understand, I think.
Perfect. So what's the book called? When's it out?
It's called Mustang, The Untold Story, and it has a longer subtitle about the development operation and something else of the Allison-engined Mustangs. It's from Key Publishing, who publish Fly Past and various other things. It is out soonish, possibly February, March. We don't have an actual date for it yet, but it's in the works and it will be soon.
I'd like to thank Matt once again for joining us on History Hack Hedge-Hopping for this bumper feature-length dive into Allison Mustangs. We've got lots more going on across the pod. We've also today a history of Chinese food with Jonathan Clements, which sounds delicious. And tomorrow we have the fascinating insights into Irish women and political activism in the 19th century. So please join the boss ladies for that. And now we ask you for your support to help History Hack keep going through 2021. In 2020, when the boss ladies, Alex and Alina, started History Hack, the world was very strange. And unfortunately, it looks like 2021 is going to be equally strange. We would love it if you're able to support the podcast in any way. It will allow us to keep up the regularity of the pods and also the great guests that we've been able to bring you over the last year. We exist on Patreon as History Hack and also on Podbean, our podcast host's own platform called Patreon. The reward tiers are being updated at the moment, so there's going to be some fantastic options for you to choose from. So if you're able to support us, that would be fantastic. So we thank you very much, and until the next time.